Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our workshop today, Leaving Bias Behind in Clinical Speech-Language Pathology Education. Monica, Katie, and I are really excited to speak to you about how to identify and reduce implicit bias in our clinical relationships. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Next slide, please. Within the context of the conference, we would go ahead and play this as an introductory short video for them. Okay. So we're going to be talking to you more extensively about cultural competency today. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. And our course objectives are a bit ambitious. We're going to be covering a bit of ground today, but we do think that all of these are pretty critical to helping us really advance our skills. And so we're going to be mindful of your time and try to be as efficient as possible. We're going to work on developing an understanding of the importance of cultural competence and cultural humility in our relationships with our supervisees. We'll review very briefly the ASHA clinical expectations for cultural proficiency and also define some key terms as we move through the presentation. There will be some specific strategies that we have to provide supervisory feedback in an unbiased way. And so we're looking forward to hearing your feedback on that as well. We're applying concepts learned in the workshop via a case study task, and then we're also going to be completing some self-reflection so that we can create a potential personal action plan by the end of the conference. So we're going to go ahead to the next slide, please, and talk about what exactly is the reason for our why. Why is this topic so important? So we bring a wealth of clinical experience to the table today, along with our shared value of the importance of mentorship in clinical education. But why this particular workshop? Well, we carry out very impactful work. And we not only empower future SLPs, but also facilitate better lives for our clients. And so in our time together today, we acknowledge your incredible skill set and also challenge you to think of how we can further enhance and grow our ability to address cultural competency as a way to reduce bias in our service delivery and also in our feedback to graduate students. Hopefully by the end of the workshop, you'll have some new strategies to consider and some additional thoughts about a personal action plan. All right. So that said, we are evidence-based clinicians and the evidence speaks the loudest, right? So let's just take a quick look at what the research is saying about cultural competence and reducing bias. So obviously accessibility and inclusion in clinical education is essential. And there have been demographic changes originally put forth by Betancourt et al. Back in 2003, where they predicted that there would be an increase in inclusivity needed for our ability to carry out our practice. And so as well, Scott currently in 2025 shares that students of color are expected to make up over 56% of the overall student population. And that was as of 2024, actually. Also, feedback is a nuanced process that's fraught with variability and predictability. And so it's very important for us to keep in mind cultural competence because it's influenced by not only individuals in context, but also their cultures. And that's from Lefroy in 2015. As well, social emotional learning has become a very large area that we have been implementing over the last several years. And Wren et al. In 24 really underscore that SEL creates spaces that welcome both supervisees and clients. The core principles of accessibility and inclusion obviously extend beyond resource allocation. And we're talking about connections, right? And fair connections between people, both between us and our supervisees, and also between them and their clients. So cross-cultural education leads to improved supervision outcomes as well as professional development for trainees. So it's really impactful, and it's a true like pebble in the pond, right? So there's a ripple effect to what we're doing, which is why it's so important for us to discuss this here today. That last information was from Govan and Gregory Martin in 2024. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So I won't take a lot of time to review this with you now. You have all become familiar with the ASHA knowledge and skills needed by speech or SLPs, speech language pathologists, providing clinical supervision. And this was originally from the 2008 document, and we'll just keep in mind, obviously, that we've evolved significantly since the original document, but the foundational principles for diversity remain the same in the context of cultural humility and reducing implicit bias. I'd also like to call attention to Section B. Sorry, next slide, please. Number 3, which is to apply culturally appropriate methods for providing feedback to supervisees. So I think it's really interesting that obviously there's a broad mandate for that, but how does that look and what do we do? And that has evolved and grown over time, but I think what we'll be talking about today is going to help us really hone in and focus in on what it is that we should be thinking about in a very practical way. All right, next slide, please. So we'd like to, now that we're just kind of getting into this topic, Monica's going to speak a little bit more about accessibility inclusion. But as far as your perspective, we'd love for you to popcorn into the chat some words or a word that you think of when you think of accessibility and inclusion. And we'll see how that compares with you and what you're thinking by the end of the conference as well. So this is where the
So now let's get into bringing awareness, accessibility and inclusion issues. So we're going to begin by centering on this awareness, talking about racial microaggressions. So those subtle comments or behaviors that may seem small, but that can deeply impact how learners and clients experience belongings. And when we researched from Sue et al. In 2007, it describes them as small but hurtful acts or harmful acts that slowly erodes trust in our spaces. So, as mentor, what we will get from ASHA, it reminds us that cultural proficiency isn't a one-time checkbox training. It's an ongoing practice on how we listen, reflect, and respond every day. Lafleur et al. In 2015 highlights that supervision is more than giving feedback. It's about how feedback is received. Cultural competence make that feedback land with care rather than defense. And then we have Scott. This reading adds that therapeutic relationship itself has a measurable effect on the outcomes. Now let's understand, just bring more awareness to this accessibility and what does that include? Well, that includes emotional and cultural safety, not just ramps and captions, just checking that box, but being aware. So when people feel safe and valued, they participate fully, and that's empowerment. So before we move on, let's take a quick pause and ask yourself, what hidden barriers might exist in an environment that prevents true inclusion? And this is when you can feel free to jot down or share aloud while we're working in this group. So now we're going to talk about designing for equity and accessibility. So framework that supports all learners. So this is when we'll highlight ADA and 504 UDL and dynamic assessment. So now that we are exploring awareness, let's shift towards the design, how it creates accessible learning and supervision and supervised environments. So ADA and Section 504 are civil rights foundation. They are guaranteed equal access for adult learners with disabilities and require that we remove barriers, not people. So think of as the starting line, not the finish line. Next comes the universal design for learning. So this framework says plan for difference from the beginning. Offer multiple ways for learners to engage, represent information, and show what they know. One size truly does not fit all. Then we add dynamic assessment, looking at how a learner learns, not just the end product. The shift helps us tailor supervision and feedback to their process, not just the outcome or their outcome. Together, these frameworks moves us forward with compliance and connection, from compliance to a connection. Um, they ensure that our teaching, mentoring, and clinical guidance reach every learner equitably. Now, this is when I would like you to take a second to think about which of these three frameworks do you already practice naturally, and which one might you want to strengthen? So now we're going to get into context matters. So social and environmental factors in learning and practice. Accessibility doesn't stop in the classroom door. The social determinants of health reminds us that like in income, transportation, housing, social support shape how people show up to learn. Any barrier with that will infringe on the way someone learns. So we need to be mindful of that. So when a mentee miss a session or seems disengaged, it may not be just motivation, it may be a circumstance. As clinical educators, we model empathy and flexibility. We adapt our supervision, recognize visible and invisible barriers, and advocate for equitable access wherever possible. Inclusion means holding space for the whole human, their culture, responsibilities, and realities. Now, I would like you to picture one learner or a supervisee you've supported recently. What non academic factor might have influenced their performance? Was it economic stress? Was it health? Was it transportation, as I mentioned, or family care? Naming those factors help us lead with more understanding rather than assumptions. So our guide and reflection here is how can I design supervision that anticipates differences rather than reacts to it? So now I would like for us to reflect, observing accessibility and inclusion in your own practice. So let's bring it from home to our own experience. Where have you personally observed accessibility or inclusion challenges? Maybe in scheduling, materials, communication, or assessment feedbacks. Now take a minute to think or jot a quick note down. It's helpful to reflect because you can always go back to use it as a resource. Taking that minute to really reflect and practice what we're preaching, right? And noticing any patterns that you may see in your writing, in your reflection, in your own setting. How do those barriers affect rapport or learning outcomes? Sharing these stories honestly and respectfully helps us recognize blind spots and collective strengths. So if you feel comfortable, let's hear one or maybe two brief examples if we were sharing in a group. Now I'd like to send it over to Katie to talk about some strategies to dismantle biases.
So we're going to hand out this little self-assessment so we can quickly get a good look at where your biases may lie. This can help you as a guide as to where you want to focus, any changes you want to make in your feedback or your evaluation of students that you may be supervising. This is from ASHA, and it is one of their cultural competence check-ins to have you self-reflect on your participation and with your students, and just like Monica was saying, to understand where your biases may lie. So we found this great article from Anne Gordon from 2021. It's from a law journal, and it's called Better Than Our Biases: Using Psychological Research to Inform Our Approach to Inclusive and Effective Feedback. It was a great article on how to de-bias yourself when providing feedback to your students. Her 3 steps, or her 3 parts, were built off of a book by Jonathan Haidt from 2006 and he used the framework of the elephant, rider, and path, which is grounded in psychological principles. It argued that even well-intentioned educators unconsciously exhibit bias when giving feedback, particularly in cross-cultural situations. Bias can negatively affect student confidence, performance, and professional opportunities. Because feedback is high stakes and emotionally charged, educators are especially vulnerable to relying on automatic, implicit judgments when stressed or cognitively overloaded. So using this metaphor of the elephant, which is the emotional and instinct or intuition, and the rider, the reason, to explain how human behavior is driven primarily by automatic emotional processes, while rational control plays a guiding but limited role. The structure and reflection matter in the development of unbiased feedback, which would be part of the path that was included at the end. So the 3 steps of tools to removing your bias from this article. The first was called Change Your Elephant. And it encourages engaging in ongoing bias and cultural humility training. Bias shows up in clinical experiences, communication style judgments, ratings of professionalism, and clinical reasoning. So we must treat learning about bias as a lifelong professional development, not a one-time training, which I think Monica touched on in her part as well. Participating in DEI or cultural humility workshops, invite students' voices and feedbacks about inclusion in the clinical sessions, and model reflective practice for your students are all ways that you can encourage this lifelong professional development. Increasing exposure to diversity in professional contexts, include case examples representing linguistic, cultural, neurodiverse, and disability variation in your any of your coursework or in your clinical education. And bringing diverse clinicians into the rounds or guest speakers or reflective discussions will also increase the exposure for your students. And lastly, emphasizing growth mindset and supervision, reinforce learning progression, not deficit thinking. Once you believe that cultural humility and feedback skills can develop, then those things will change within your practice. Next slide. The second step would be strengthening your rider, which would encourage keeping a healthy clinical educator will help you provide mindfulness in your feedback. So feedback can trigger bias when the emotional stakes are high, their cross-cultural interactions occur, or educators fear saying the wrong thing. So in your clinical practice, some strategies would be to pause before delivering your feedback, name and notice feelings that arise in these sessions for yourself as well as maybe for the student, and to use supervision reflection prompts like whose voice is missing here. Being aware that this mindfulness is needed will just help reduce some of that bias. So also reducing cognitive fatigue on yourself during an assessment of students, maybe building a structured feedback time and not a hallway drive-by immediately following the session because you have to run to your next client or participate in something else, will decrease any biases that might come in, because biases can increase when the supervisors are tired, hungry, overloaded, rushed between patients, which is pretty much all the time. So using these structured feedbacks times can help you decompress and get on a steady, on a good mindset to talk to your students and provide that feedback that will be helpful. Avoid writing evaluations at the end of a long day. Maybe wait until doing it until the next day, so your mind is clear and you're able to be more reflective on what happened. And then the third step would be shaping the path. So using a structured evaluation reduces that gut-based judgment that can be more subjective. So it's recommended to use something that's more objective. So using a rubric, especially one that might be aligned with competencies. So using clear competency-based rubrics, whether it's ASHA or any other PT or OT or any other organization that does have competencies, using those rubrics to grade makes a consistent grading system where all students are treated equally. You would share the rubrics early so they know what that's expected of them, which can make it more consistent for them as well. And so then auditing your feedback and evaluation practices, check for patterns in your comments, in your scores, who you labeled different things: confident, quiet, professional, needs motivation. So see if certain students get more direct reading remediation than others. Do we praise style more than substance for some students? Are communication norms culturally narrow? Those are things to all reflect on after auditing your feedback from past evaluations. Delivering feedback using equitable practices. When you use something that is consistent over the students with a consistent measuring style, then technically all students should be assessed equally. Using reflective supervision questions, what supported your decision making, to help them reflect more on what they were doing and why they wouldn't maybe have met the competency. So as far as our reflection in this in-service, what would your rubric look like? What would you include? What competencies would you use? And how would you measure it to make it consistent? We've shared here, and this is a rubric that we have developed at New York Medical College. It's very specific, using competencies from ASHA, specifically in different areas required for professional practice, diagnostics, evaluation, therapy, cultural responsive practice, and we measure, and each feedback form, we have 3 ways that they can be rated. So satisfactory, and there's a specific number that they need to meet. So 80% consistency with general guidance. Emerging shows developing skills but needs additional guidance. And unsatisfactory, still not evident, or student shows little or no improvement. And what we have done is made different benchmarks for midterms and final. So we are showing improvements from the midterm to the final, and showing different mastery as you should be improving over the semester. And then we have different feedback forms for internal 1, internal 2, and then our externships. So these benchmarks will be higher, and by the end, and by their last semester, they should be demonstrating independent skills with 80% consistency. So your requirements will be more applicable to your studies and where you are in your training. So in summary, using this elephant rider and path analogy, with the elephant, we want to manage our implicit reactions by getting this trainings, DEI trainings, cultural humility trainings, diverse role models, and growth mindset. With our rider, we want to increase deliberate control with reflection, mindfulness, plan, feedback, and avoid fatigue zones. And with the path, we want to fix the systems and provide structure. So competency-based rubrics, standardized evaluation, and auditing of our feedback and our language. But the bottom line being, educators are prone to bias, especially in stressful or cross-cultural feedback settings. We're using intentional self-reflection, structured evaluation tools, stress management, and inclusive communication strategies. We can reduce the bias and help all of our students thrive. We're going to go back to Antonella, who's going to go over a case study so we can summarize and see how we might use these strategies in real time.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Before we move into the details of the case study, I just wanted to share there's a great resource that is newly published or more recently published. It's edited by Alicia Fleming Hamilton and several of her colleagues, and they do explore cultural responsiveness in a really practical and thoughtful way. There are a number of different case studies that are presented in the book that really cover a number of the areas that we address in not only in clinical practice, but also in the types of scenarios that we often come across really every day of our practice, but really allow us to stop and think and create some objective questions, but also explore our own feelings about them in order to reduce bias. So I would highly recommend this, and I wanted to let you know that we were going to be using one of the case studies that they very thoughtfully put together. It's actually from page 149 of their book, and it's actually called I Stutter and I Have an Accent. Can I Be Your Speech Pathologist? So you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so it is important, as we've all been, as Monica and Katie have been sharing, to really think about being aware of some multiple factors. So Katie's strategies are really practical, and they really help us to think about not only our elephant and our rider, but that concept of that system one thinking, which is going to be very quick and kind of more prone to bias versus the rider thinking, which is going to be system two and a little bit more deliberate. And I think when we're working with our students, we really need to think about, the power dynamics across cultures, for example, and in those professional relationships, and kind of how those play out across not only the context of clients and their culture, but also our supervisees and their culture. In this particular case, there is this young man was experiencing some stuttering or disfluency. And he also was a bilingual Cantonese English speaker. So there were some accentedness features to his speech, but it's really critical for us to distinguish among dialect, accent, and speech sound disorders, right? So we really need to be thinking about that as well as within the sessions that they're providing for their clients. So next slide, please. So this is about Jan, and he is a graduate student who is 24. He is, as I said, he's Asian American, and so he's Cantonese and English bilingual. His supervisor is a white female supervisor, and he had some stuttering that was noted intermittently since elementary school. However, he's had successful therapy as an undergraduate for fluency, and he also had some consultation already for some accent management because he felt that he needed to go ahead and address that as far as English being his second language. Intelligibility, which is obviously one of our big functional measurements, right? How understandable we are, was not something that was particularly impacted by his accent. So the first session, this is his first time graduate student, master's level, first time internal experience. And he was working with a pediatric client for reading and for phonemic awareness. But while he was working with the client, the supervisor came in several times and interrupted the session, not only to assist his client, but also to facilitate his phoneme or sound production within the session, because she felt that he needed to have his speech corrected as well. And so a little bit, right, we might be able to identify a little bit of system one thinking there. Maybe she was, reacting in a way that was something that was in the moment versus something perhaps that they had discussed prior. So the supervisor did recommend some fluency strategies, but Jan had felt that these fluency strategies were not as helpful as some of his previously learned strategies. His stuttering was increasing a bit because I believe, in that high, in the intensity of the session, perhaps there was some increased disfluency on his part. And his culture expects different deference to teachers. And so he felt like he couldn't necessarily contradict his supervisor or openly disagree with her about the fact that he had strategies that would work better. And she felt that perhaps he wasn't taking on the initiative to go ahead and be able to make some changes that she had recommended. So you can go to the next slide, please. And we're going to think a little bit about how we could provide equitable feedback, have some equitable practices for feedback, but also really think about how we're going to be providing that feedback. So how would we change our rider here, our system, our ability to maybe reassess pre-session? What is our planning? What are we looking at ahead of time? Let's go ahead and remember those ADA and Section 504 protections, and really try to think about using some more of that deliberate, logical, problem-solving system two thinking. And what should we be mindful of? So we want to avoid that system one thinking, right? So we want to be a little bit more mindful and a little bit more intentional. So we're going to pause, like Katie had mentioned. We're going to definitely pause and think about what we're going to doing as opposed to perhaps going right into that session. We want to maybe be a little bit more curious. When is this happening? What are the parameters around it? Having some cultural humility regarding how the feedback is provided, right? Because as Monica mentioned, the feedback is something that we need to provide, but it would change based on the person and how that might land with that particular person and based on their own experiences. We also need to be mindful of how our students, based on their culture, are interacting with us. So for example, collectivist kind of predisposition versus individualist. So Jan was avoiding conflict. His culture was collectivist. He was avoiding conflict. He was promoting his goal is to promote harmony, right? To show deference to someone who's in a position of authority. Whereas his supervisor was feeling like, well, where is this student's independence? Where is their self-reliance? Why aren't they getting more involved? And that may have been because she had more of an individualist perspective. But as supervisors, the onus is on us to really be able to think about those aspects. So that's how we could be more mindful. We also want to think about the power dynamics on behavior and on other people's speech behavior. When we're speaking with someone and we are feeling maybe a little bit uneasy, we may also be disfluent. So how is that impacting performance? And is it a fair assessment, right? To be able to really look at that as something that would be consistent over time. We want to examine our own beliefs. We want to think about perhaps any implicit biases we have about accented speech, and remembering that accented speech is not a disorder. And so what other strategies would we want to think about? So obviously the rubrics that we had talked about that Katie had mentioned, delivering feedback using the rubric, making it equitable across students and across sessions and across their experience levels. And whose voice is missing? Well, in this particular scenario, it seems like maybe Jan's voice was missing. It seems like the professor or supervisor seemed to feel like she had a handle on what it was that needed to happen and what needed to be done, but she didn't really ever engage him to find out a little bit more about what he was thinking or feeling and why he may be, doing something within a particular session. We also want to avoid that communicating that his accent is inferior. We don't want to think about deficit thinking, or we want to have that growth mindset, right? So we want to highlight the student's strengths, definitely encouraging the student, helping him understand that bilingualism is something that he could bring to help support his clients as well. So that's something that we want to do to be able to shape our path. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I think this is just something that, this is just one case scenario. Obviously, I'm sure that all of us could think about different things that have gone on even just in this past week, and be able to think about how we could, use these strategies to maybe shift what we had done. And, there's no pointing fingers here. There's no having done anything wrong. It's about really just being a little bit more self-aware and kind of thinking about how can we enhance and refine and grow for next time. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. I just wanted to, we wanted to just review some of the, terminology that we'd use. So we talked about implicit bias and system 1 thinking, system 2 thinking, and accessibility and inclusion. And really what we're looking for is to enhance accessibility and inclusion so that we are creating a sense of belonging for our students. And Brene Brown, in her 2019 book of Braving the Wilderness, talks about belonging, and the opposite of belonging is fitting in. So we want to help our mentees to belong and create some belonging for their clients as well. Graduate supervisors hold significant potential to influence the cultural competence of those under their guidance. So that's really important for us to remember. And I'm just going to move to my notes here. I apologize. I think the other aspect that I think that Brene Brown talks about too is coming to the table. And so I feel like as supervisors, we're going to invite our students to the table. We're going to make sure that they have a seat, and then we're going to let them feel valued in that space. So we're going to be able to really maximize that accessibility, that inclusion, and that belonging. All right, so next slide, please. We're going to go to future directions, and just remember that we have a really big role here. And I know that we all are really great at our jobs, but we're going to continue to grow, I'm sure, and really take on this aspect of social justice for our work every day. Next slide, please. So we're going to wrap up here. And we thank you for your attention. We're going to leave you with this quote from Maya Angelou about really growing and taking action. And don't forget your course evaluation and your CEUs. Monica, Katie, and I want to thank you for joining us today and are so grateful that you shared your time with us. So thanks, everyone. Resources are available at the end of the PowerPoint and on your handouts. So feel free to reach out with any questions. Think back to that word that you used about accessibility inclusion and see if you might change that now. It might be a way to kind of get started on that personal action plan. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.